Hi, everybody. This is Bob Kendrick, president of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
We were just talking off mic about some of the stuff you guys are working on. I'm old enough to remember a time when you all were just getting started, and it was, people talking about existential crisis all the time. But for legit for you guys, it was hard. It's hard to start a museum and to get enough people to come and then come back and get all the schools in a line so they come through. And it is tough to do, but now we're talking about big things for the Negro League Museum and the places that you're going. So one, congratulations on taking it and getting past like the can we stay open to the how are we going to cone out all of this stuff, man. I'm super excited for your guys' success, and let's talk about raising some money.
Well, and we're super excited about it as well. And you're right, it's painstaking to try and build something from the ground up that folks will embrace. And
Right.
particularly when you're talking about a niche kind of history like the Negro Leagues, where so many people did not know that a Negro Leagues even existed, no less to the magnitude in which these leagues existed in our country. But you
Yeah.
know what? It has made the journey that much more sweeter because essentially what you've done is what the detractors didn't think you could do. When we anchored here at historic 18th and Vine in 1990, some of our most ardent supporters were questioning the decision because 18th and Vine was like a lot of other urban areas that were once very proud and prominent and vibrant. It had died. It had died. And honestly, the city of Kansas City had seemingly turned its back on an area that everything our city hangs its hat on: jazz and baseball. It all and barbecue. It
Yeah.
all originates right here in this very area, and it had kind of turned its back. And here comes this fledgling Negro Leagues Baseball Museum telling the world that we're going to anchor here in this area. And people
Mhm.
looked at us kind of side eyed and like, I don't know about that one. But thanks to the tremendous wisdom and foresight of my dear friend and former chairman of the board of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum and the founder of this museum, the late great Buck O'Neill, who said, "This is where we will build this museum. And by doing so, we will not only preserve, celebrate, educate the public about this very important chapter of baseball and Americana, but we're also going to help revitalize this area that had, as I mentioned, been so proud and prominent and prevalent during that era of American segregation." That was in 1990, and we haven't looked back since. We started in a little one-room office at that time where the guys who, and it was Buck and a number of other local Negro leaguers and others, literally took turns paying the monthly rent to keep the little office open. And that is what fueled this dream of building our current home. And here we are now on the horizon of launching a significant capital campaign to build a brand new state of the art Negro Leagues Baseball Museum right around the corner from where we currently operate the old Paseo YMCA, which is the birthplace of the Negro Leagues. That's where the leagues were established on February 13th, 1920, by Andrew Rube Foster. And we're in essence going full circle right back to that very location. We're renovating the former Paseo YMCA, and then we will build a new 30,000 plus square foot Negro Leagues Baseball Museum built adjacent to that historic landmark, creating what I call the nation's first Negro Leagues campus as the gateway into historic 18th and Vine and an international headquarters for both Black baseball and social history. Man, that's a long way from that little one room office that it all got started in. It's a daunting task to have to go out and raise some 25, $30 million to make this project come to fruition. But it is
Yeah.
time. It is absolutely time. And we think that people will be supportive of this effort, and we hope that they will.
This history isn't all that ancient either. I mean, Willie Mays played in the Negro Leagues. He is still alive.
He's still with us. God, keep him healthy and
Yeah.
whole. And I hope we're all in prayer mode that he can be in Birmingham June
Yeah.
20th for
Yeah.
that epic Negro League salute between the St. Louis Cardinals and the San Francisco Giants. although I should say, AKA the St. Louis Stars versus the San Francisco Sea Lions, as both teams are slated to wear the old uniforms of those two respective teams in this epic salute to the Negro Leagues there at Rickwood Field, which I guess you could say is the Negro Leagues version of Field of Dreams.
Yeah.
And so, Pete, when they started that Field of Dreams game in Dyersville, Iowa, a few years ago, and baseball fans really embraced it. They loved it. But as I remind people, that was a movie. That was a movie that baseball helped bring to life in its own way. But Rickwood Field and this salute to the Negro Leagues, this is REAL. It's not REEL like the movie. This is REAL. This is a real recreation of what once took place in Rickwood Field as a 17-year-old Willie Mays steps out on that field patrolling center field for the Birmingham Black Barons and the litany of great stars who passed through Rickwood Field. It is tremendous and too many for me to actually rattle off at any one period of time. So this is going to be an epic celebration. And I tip my cap to all my friends over at Major League Baseball for making this happen. It is going to have the international baseball community squarely looking at this game and paying tribute to the Negro Leagues.
Yeah, it's remarkable. And look, baseball has a lot of problems, and I don't know, like Kansas, you guys are trying to figure out how to build, if you're going to build a new yard, the A's and Oakland and Las Vegas, and there's just a lot of animosity. But in other areas, I think baseball is really showing the other major sports. This is how you preserve your history. This is how you move the game around. So, because not only did we have Korea this year, we'll have London in a couple of weeks, but also Alabama. And so they're doing a great job of doing that, but also keeping that message alive. We're just weeks away from Lou Gehrig Day, which I was at. You're going to love this story, Bob. I can't tell the story enough. My buddy Phil has ALS. And so we went to the Dodger game last year. And it's the icon event for the year. And so they're playing the Yankees on Lou Gehrig Day. And so Phil goes into the tunnel before the game, and he's talking to Aaron Judge. And he and Aaron Judge are talking. Phil's an athlete, former national champion with Washington football back in the early 90s. And so Aaron says to Phil, "I'm going to hit you 2 home runs today." And Phil's like, "Cool. That's awesome." Aaron Judge did not hit 2 home runs that day. You know who did? Mookie Betts. You know what happened? Do you know what happened the next day? Aaron Judge ran into that fence because the Babe and Lou said, no. If you promise 2 to the ALS guy, you have to deliver. And he didn't do it. And that's the baseball gods are part of this thing, man. And I don't know what you think about the baseball, but there is something about baseball where things balance out, where there's attention paid. And you're like, how in the world did these things come about? I mean, Aaron Judge, it's just crazy. So what are your thoughts, on the gods of baseball?
And you're absolutely right. No sport holds to its history the way baseball does.
Yeah.
And it's still by far the most romanticized sport of them all.
That's right.
We measure periods in our lives by baseball. And whoever your favorite baseball player was when you were a kid, in all likelihood will be your favorite baseball player for the rest of your life. And really, out of the major sports, it's the one sport where we compare the greats of yesteryear with the stars of today.
Yeah.
Whereas I think the other major sports, we just assume that those who are playing now are better athletes, were better at that particular sport, but not baseball. Henry Aaron was my all-time favorite baseball player and my childhood idol. And so in my mind and heart, there will never be another baseball player better than Henry Aaron. Pete, even if he's better than Henry Aaron, I will never admit it. And so
Yep. Yeah. Yeah.
And so the mystique that is baseball, and my good friend, the great writer, Joe Posnanski,
shout out,
my brother from another mother, he said something to me that honestly I had not thought about it in this particular light. He said that baseball is really the only sport that constantly looks back. The other sports look ahead. And so when you think about this, the biggest off-season event in basketball and in football is this draft, the NBA draft, the NFL draft.
Mm-hmm.
The biggest off-season event for baseball is the Hall of Fame induction, because we want to pay honor to those who played it at a certain level, for all those years. And I just found that to be interesting and so very true. And I think it just speaks to that romantic nature that is indeed baseball.
Yeah. You said a lot there, and I want to go back a little bit because my guy is Ricky Henderson, because so I just, through the luck of the baseball gods, I end up at the game where he debuts, and my parents didn't know. They weren't following minor league baseball. We just showed up. And then by luck, I ended up at the game in '89 when the A's reacquired him from the Yankees. And so we have this long history. When I was a little kid, Bob, I would water the yard with the sprinklers. And then I put on my fake A's batting helmet and I would run and I would slide head first because Ricky Henderson was stealing bases.
Yeah.
And when we played pickle, you're like, I can do what Ricky can do. And so it's just seared into my being. And, it's part of the reason why I still love the A's to this day and Ricky. And I think Ricky is such a great ambassador of the game himself. Look, some people kind of cartoon this guy, but I think as we get older, we start to realize that he is brilliant.
We should appreciate him more than we probably do.
Yeah.
And I don't know if a Hall of Famer can be underrated. Right. But in my mind, he is one of the most underrated Hall of Famers, because people oftentimes ask me, well, who do you compare him to from the Negro League? And the answer is no one.
Nobody.
Ricky Henderson is in a class by himself as a leadoff hitter who brought both power and speed to that role. There's nobody that I can even remotely think of that, Oscar Charleston would be the guy, but Charleston didn't lead off. Charleston gonna hit 3-4 in your lineup. Yeah. Ricky was supposed to be the table setter who not only set the table,
yeah.
He hit the ball out the ballpark.
Man.
And if you got a walk, that's a double. Could be a triple. Yep. There could be a triple. And he is a throwback to the Negro Leagues, the way he played the game, the flair in which he played the game. And so when we inducted him into what we call the Hall of Game, that was one of my favorite moments here at the museum. And the Hall of Game annually honors former major league greats who we believe played the game the way they did in the Negro Leagues. So you played it with passion, you played it with high skill, but you also played it with a little, as the kids would say, with some swag. Yeah. You had to have that if you go play in the Negro Leagues, and Ricky had that and then some. And to walk him through this museum was one of my favorite tours of all time, because people kind of have maybe a misperception of him, because Ricky was very confident, and he wasn't bashful about telling you how confident he was in his abilities. But to walk him through this museum, just as it was when I walked Barry Bonds through this museum, to see how humbled they both were by what they were absorbing as they went through this museum. Because I remind folks all the time, if you have, as it relates to African-American and Hispanic baseball players, if you have any sense of self, when you walk through this place, you feel it.
You're right.
You have to pay homage to those, as my friend Buck O'Neill would say, who built the bridge. They built the bridge across the chasm of prejudice that allowed Ricky Henderson and others who look like Ricky Henderson to go on and have an opportunity to play this game and then become Hall of Famers at this game.
Yeah. One of the things that our friend Joe Posnanski says, he's been on the show several times, is, Ricky Henderson was the guy you wanted to walk the least and walked the most, and he, he's not only a table setter, but he killed his own meat. He went out and
Oh,
he'll
no, he
drive
didn't.
himself in.
No, that's what
Yeah,
I'm saying.
yeah,
He set the table, fixed the dinner, and everything else that came along.
yeah, yeah. I remember in the 80s, Whitey Herzog just passed this week, but they had, Coleman and all those speedsters, Willie McGee, Ozzie Smith for sure, but everybody, it was a contest. And unlike the Earl Weaver approach, but nothing against that, but he's like, I'm going to get you on first, and your job is to distract that pitcher. And nobody was better than that than Ricky and Vince. Again, I used to talk about in KC back then, they had the sliding box. For the audience, this, but they had the sliding box, and it's like, Vince is one leg off of the sliding box, and he's on one leg on the turf, and you're like, now he's got two legs on the turf. Like, oh my gosh, he's got his lead, and so you've got to decide: do you try to pick him off? Not going to get him. Do you try to throw behind him? He's going to steal the base anyhow. And so the pitcher is just playing, and Ricky was the master of that game. And I'll say this too, and then I'm going to throw it back to you. Ricky Henderson stole third base as many times as other base stealers like Luis Polonia and Gary Reedus, Dave Concepcion. These are guys that stole a lot of bases. He stole third that many times as they did their entire career.
Exactly. And like I said, he was a throwback to the old Negro Leagues. One of my very best friends, and I miss him dearly, was the late, great Lou Brock. And of course, Buck O'Neil signed Lou Brock to the Chicago Cubs out of Southern University. And Buck was the last guy to sign off on the ill-fated trade that sent Lou to St. Louis for a hurt arm pitcher named Ernie Broglio. Now, granted, Ernie Broglio had been a 20-game winner previously, but he was damaged goods by the time the Cardinals sent him over to Chicago. And Buck says that the Cubs came to him really kind of just out of respect because they knew Lou was his guy and said, well, Buck, we're thinking about trading Lou over to St. Louis for Ernie Broglio. What do you think about it? And Buck, said, being a good company guy, he said, yeah, no, that's a good deal. We need pitching. Buck said he knew it was a bad deal, but he also knew that it was also going to be the best opportunity for Lou to have a chance to play every day. And they send Lou over to St. Louis. Lou becomes a Hall of Famer. He propels the Cards almost instantly into playoff contention and ultimately to the World Series. And Ernie Broglio only comes up now when we talk about some of the bad trades that ever happened. And Buck said every time he went to Busch Stadium in St. Louis at that time, he said the fans gave him a standing ovation for the gift that kept on giving. But Lou says that when he gets to St. Louis, the first person to reach out to him, the legendary Cool Papa Bell.
Oh, man.
Cool Papa Bell. Cool was living in St. Louis. And Lou said, well, I knew who Cool Papa was. I didn't know Cool Papa knew who I was. And he said he takes the meeting with Cool Papa, and Cool Papa realized that Lou had a gift, his legs. And he says Cool Papa starts telling him some things about base stealing and base running that he had never heard before. He said, Cool Papa, I never saw this in the book. He said, Cool Papa looked at me and said, because this ain't in the book. Yeah. And so that speed that was so prevalent in the Negro Leagues, the athleticism transitioned over with Jackie Robinson. And the game was at a pace that held fans' interest. Pete, I'm glad to see the stolen bases coming back.
Yeah.
And it took changes of the rules to bring it back, but I'm glad to see it back. Because when you steal a base and everybody in the stadium know that you're going to try and steal this base, including the opposition.
Yeah.
But they don't know what pitch you're going on. But you can feel the excitement and energy start to build in the stadium. And you mentioned Whitey Herzog, who I think had the last team that I would call built like a Negro Leagues team. The speed that they had. When you talk about Coleman and McGee and Ozzie Smith and Andy Van Slyke, those guys could run. Now,
Phew.
our 14 and 15 Kansas City Royals were built similar. And at some point, Ned realized he had these thoroughbreds and he needed to turn them loose.
Yeah.
And they started running. And what happens? It permeates through the entire team. So here's Billy Butler, Billy Country Butler. He's seeing his other teammates steal bases. Now I got to steal a base, and it brings a level of excitement and that's what the Negro Leagues gave you. That's what
Yeah.
the Negro Leagues gave you, and Ricky embodied that.
Yeah, man. So you've got. Did you ever get a chance to meet Cool Papa Bell? Did you guys overlap at all? I know he dies in early night. No. Oh man.
And I didn't get to meet Satchel, and I didn't get to meet Cool, and
Yeah.
I feel like I knew them both because all the stories I've heard the players tell about them.
Yeah.
But if I had any disappointment, and I haven't had much disappointment in my role here at the Negro Leagues Museum through all these years, and I've been involved with this organization since 1993. So we're talking about 31 years of involvement. But if I had some disappointment, it would be the fact that I did not get to meet Cool Papa or the great Leroy Satchel Paige.
Yeah. But you did get to meet Minnie Minoso and all the other guys. I got to meet Minnie Minoso because I used to live in Wrigleyville, and he would be all the time out there.
Oh.
And you're like, that's cool. I got to get over to see Minnie, and he was just a great advocate for the game. Well, and Bob, you are such a wonderful treasure, man. And I hope that someone's capturing the stories that you have collected because there is no more Lou Brock, right? There is no more Cool Papa.
No,
it's you.
And, fortunately, we do this podcast that I do with Sirius XM Radio called Black Diamonds. And we're getting ready to start season 4 of that. So a lot of these stories are being documented. And of course, the work that we're doing in the video game, MLB The Show. And we debuted the Negro Leagues in the video game MLB The Show 23 last year with 8 Negro League players. The 24 edition will have 10 more Negro League players added. And honestly, Pete, it's been one of the biggest things that this museum has ever done. And who knew that it would be a video game? Because you're reaching a different generation of young folks and young adults who likely would have never thought about the Negro Leagues until they were able to engage and be entertained by the Negro Leagues through this video game. And I was out in San Francisco recently where the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum and Sony were honored by the Entertainment Software Association for what we were doing to teach history through the video game. And it has been so vitally important to create this connection. And it has made me now a household name in the gaming community because I'm in the video game telling stories about these players and other little vignettes about the Negro Leagues. And I'll be honest, I was surprised at how they've embraced the stories. I knew they would love the players. I mean, what's not to love about Satchel Paige and the swagger that Satchel Paige brought to the game itself? And so it might have just been a matter of them not knowing, but once you knew about Satchel and all these other great stars, was not to love about them. But the storytelling aspect of this, they have really embraced. They can't get enough of the stories. And we've seen people come all summer long last year after this game was released. Folks were coming to this museum because they saw the museum in the video game and they wanted to meet the guy that was telling the stories in the video game. Yours truly. And it's been amazing. And I tell the story all the time. I was taking a group of potential investors on a tour of the museum. Of course, we are working on an effort to try and bring expansion Major League Baseball to Nashville. And Pete, I like to speak these things into existence. When it happens, the team will be called the Nashville Stars after the old Negro Leagues team. It'll be the first time in baseball history that a Major League team carried the name of a Negro Leagues team. And so I'm taking them on a tour of the museum. We get out on the Field of Legends where the life-size statues are. And I'm going through the litany of introductions of the players, one by one as they are in position there on the Field of Legends. And we get to Satchel Paige. And I'm telling my Satchel Paige story as I traditionally do. And for those who may be listening and watching, Satchel Paige had names for his pitches. So he didn't have fastball, curveball, changeup, slider. Not Satchel. Satchel had what he called his midnight creeper. He had the two humper. He had the bat dodger. He had the hesitation pitch. He had the long tom, the short tom, the jump ball, the trouble ball, the radio ball, the wobbly ball, the dipsy do. And he also, Pete, had a pitch that he famously called his B ball.
My favorite.
Typically, I would pose the question to my guest, do you know why he called it the B ball? And when I raised the question, there was a young white kid there with his father. Couldn't have been more than 9, 10 years old. He's standing right down the third base line on the field, and he looks at me, and he sticks out his chest. He raises his hand. He said, Mr. Kendrick, I know why Satchel called it the B-ball. I say, you do? Well, tell the folks why Satchel called it the B-ball. He says Satchel called it the B-ball because Satchel says it bees where I want it to be when I want it to be there. And I looked at him, I said, man, you must have been playing the show. And his daddy looks at me and he says, yes, he's been playing the show and he's been paying attention to the stories that you're sharing in the show. Yeah. And it's just a great example of the impact that this game is having already. And not only are they engaged, but they are also interested in retaining this. As, learning is at its optimal when you're learning and you're having fun at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to go back to the Field of Legends because I think this is a thing you guys got right, intentionally or not. I can go down to LA Live and I can go see the almost 30-foot tall statue of Shaq up on a plinth. There's the Harry Carey. I used to live at Wrigley Field. I used to live on Sheffield, just outside of right field. Barry Bonds in batting practice hit a ball over the field, over the sidewalks, which are those wide 30-footers, over the street, over the next giant sidewalk, and 4 stories up into our building and broke a damn window. So I've seen all these things, but you can't even get to Harry Carey anymore. And that's not the case with the Field of Legends. These are regular sized men. And you can, and like you said earlier, Martin Digo speaks to you. You can walk. Oh my God, it's amazing. It's powerful.
You feel their spirits. You do. You feel their spirits when you walk out there. And you're right. The fact that you can stand side by side, shoulder to shoulder with Satchel Paige, Martin Dihigo, Buck Leonard, Pop Lloyd, Judy Johnson, Ray Dandridge, Cool Papa Bell, Oscar Charleston, Leon Day, Josh Gibson. And you can stand there side by side. And last year, the great former NFL running back, Marshawn Lynch, he does a pregame show for Thursday Night Football called In Your City. And so before the Chiefs played Denver on a Thursday night, Marshawn comes to town to shoot a piece here at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. And he has Patrick Mahomes' father, Pat Mahomes Sr., with him. And they go over to the site where the leagues were formed in the Paseo YMCA and hang out, talk a little bit. And then they come over to see me for me to take them on a tour of the museum. And here was Marshawn. The minute he walked through those turnstiles, and as you may recall, you walk into the turnstiles and you look through the old chicken wire backstop onto the field. But you can't immediately get to the field until you essentially learn their story. And then the very last thing happens is that you've earned the right to take the field. And so he walks into the chicken wire backstop and he's looking out on the field. Now, this is a football player, not a baseball player. And he looks at me, and the first words that came out of his mouth, I feel something.
Yeah.
I feel something, because you do feel their spirits. And it was not lost on this young man that even though he made his living in a different sports discipline, football, that he still owed it to those heroes of the Negro Leagues for affording him the opportunity to play the game that he loves, which just happened to be football. And that level of respect just, again, warms my heart. Yeah. And we did the tour. And of course, The video went viral because he is hilarious. Yeah, he is absolutely hilarious for a guy who didn't want to talk to the media when he was playing. Now he's a media darling. And we had just a grand time walking around, taking a tour of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum.
It is a remarkable place. It's in Kansas City. If you guys are ever anywhere near Kansas City, you just got to spend time and go down there. They have another amazing museum attached to it. And then just around the corner is this fantastic riverboat. And all of these things, that part of KC, it's just great. People kind of don't understand how complex Kansas City. I lived there for a while doing some training before I went to Iraq one time. And, there's all these neighborhoods and districts. The World War I museum there, you talk about spirits. You walk over that, I'm feeling right now.
Oh, yeah, with the absolutely.
Over the poppies, and you're like, oh my gosh, my eyes are going up.
Yeah.
That
it's a beautiful, beautiful museum. And we're very proud that there are two national museums in Kansas City. The National World War I Museum and the National Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. And again, we started from much humble roots, far more humble roots than my friends at World War I. They had some money. The Negro Leagues Museum didn't have any money, and yet we've been able to again navigate the economic landscape for now over, 34 years of operations and dreaming big about the future of this organization. But they are amazing. People kind of sleep on Kansas City. They shouldn't. The degree of culture and heritage that is here in Kansas City and the Midwest in general is second to none. Because even when we talk civil rights, we typically think the South. We think Dr. King. We think Montgomery, Birmingham, Georgia. But when I think about the civil rights movement itself, three of the most pivotal moments in civil rights history occurs here in the Kansas City area. One was Jackie Robinson being handpicked from the Kansas City Monarchs to break baseball's color barrier. See, people seem to forget that Jackie's illustrious professional baseball career began in the Negro Leagues right here in Kansas City, 1945, when he was playing for the Kansas City Monarchs. I think people think, Pete, that he just walked out of nowhere and started playing for the Brooklyn Dodgers, but his real rookie season was 1945. And he was only here for 5 months. The 5 months that he was here, again, he fell in love with everything Kansas City's famous for, barbecue and jazz. And 5 months later, he had literally disappeared. I was very blessed to know several of his 1945 Kansas City Monarch teammates. And if they were alive, they'd tell you when Jackie joined the Monarchs, there was no fanfare surrounding Jackie whatsoever. He was just another ball player trying to make the Monarchs' great roster, but they knew he was different than they were. And Buck O'Neil would surmise it in this fashion. We had become acclimated to segregation, not Jackie Robinson. He's Pasadena, California. He is UCLA. That whole Jim Crow thing didn't sit well with him whatsoever. But beyond that, that was it. And 5 months later, he was gone. He was gone. His teammates had no idea where he was. And of course, we now know that he was meeting with Branch Rickey, where the two of them would make the monumental decision that he would become the chosen one to break Major League Baseball's then 6-decade-long self-imposed color barrier. And here we make the assertion that Jackie's breaking of the color barrier wasn't just a part of the civil rights movement, it was the beginning of the civil rights movement in this country. And that it predates those more noted civil rights occurrences. So Jackie's breaking of the color barrier, he signed right here from the Kansas City Monarchs, to be that guy.
Yeah.
But Brown versus the Board of Education, right up the road in Topeka, Kansas, right up the road from here. That is a monumental part of the civil rights movement. That's a noted civil rights occurrence. And then right up the road from us in Independence, Missouri, our very own president, Harry S. Truman, who would eventually integrate the armed forces, but he does that a year after Jackie breaks the color barrier. Those are three pivotal moments in civil rights history And that's before we even talk about the Buffalo Soldiers there in Leavenworth, Kansas. So this city is as steep in culture as any, and people have kind of slept on Kansas City. But man, y'all better wake up here as Kansas City's got it going on. We just built the first ever women's professional stadium for the soccer team, the Kansas City Current, the world's only women soccer, women's stadium. It just happens that soccer is going to be played there.
Yeah.
Back-to-back Super Bowl titles with our Kansas City Chiefs, a brand new airport, the World Cup coming to Kansas City in 26. Hopefully a new Negro Leagues Baseball Museum somewhere in and around that time. Now, there's a lot of great things happening in Kansas City, and I'm a proud Kansas Citian, as you can tell, even though it's the way of Georgia that I got here.
Back to Jackie a little bit. So Jackie grows up in LA. My grandfather was maybe 2 years younger than him, and so they have overlap in their high school careers. Jackie's a multi-sport star. My grandfather, multi-sport star. Also in that era is Louis Zamperini, who ends up becoming a world-class runner and Olympian. The Olympics that Jackie's brother Mac went to. Mm-hmm. There was the lady who Gina Davis plays in A League of Their Own. One of the main inspirations for that character went to my grandfather's high school. And this is back before.
That's so
cool.
Cool.
Women did like demonstration sports back then. They didn't have girls softball. It was like, hey, we're going to do sports day, and the girls wore skirts and everything. And this girl's like, no, I throw the ball. Yeah. And and so she knew, like, I can look at my grandfather's yearbook and I can see them signing to each other, and
that's pretty cool.
You have all of these amazing things. I don't think my grandfather and Jackie ever were on the same field at the same time, but their teams occasionally played each other. They weren't quite in the same district, so they didn't always play. But I wanted to, like, this is my grandfather. This is not ancient history. This is something that happened in the 40s. And then the last thing that Jackie does before he gets out of the Army is he's fighting this this dishonorable discharge case because he chose to sit where he wanted to.
Yeah, right. He was court-martialed for his refusal to give up his seat to a white person on the bus.
Yeah.
Now, mind you, this is well before Rosa Parks.
Yeah. And he's an officer, by the way. Like, this is like
Jackie, of course, he won his court-martial trial and was honorably discharged from the U.S. Army. Well, it was right after he was discharged from the Army is that he writes to Kansas City Monarchs owner James Leslie Wilkinson and asks for a tryout.
Yeah.
They try him out in Houston, Texas. He makes the team. And as I oftentimes say, well, as I say in my podcast, Black Diamonds, little did J.L. Wilkinson know he had just signed a man that was going to put him out of business. Yeah, because 5 months later, Jackie's gone. And then once Jackie breaks the color barrier, this now opens the door for other Black and brown athletes to move into Major League Baseball, which signaled the death knell of the Negro Leagues.
The thing too about all of that with Jackie, one, he doesn't have a particularly brilliant baseball career at UCLA. Joe Posnanski's written about this. Like, his last year, he battled like 085 or something. It was terrible.
He was a baseball player at UCLA. He led UCLA, but he wasn't a great baseball player at UCLA. He was a great athlete, however, and one of the greatest athletes in American sports history. But I remind people that baseball, honestly, was his weakest sport. Yeah, he's much better basketball, football, track athlete than he was baseball player, and some say an even better tennis player.
Yeah.
Something that Jackie couldn't do, and he certainly turned himself into a great baseball player. But even when the time he gets to the Monarchs, he hadn't played a lot of baseball, but when he gets to the Monarchs and things start to take off for him, he has a great season, those 5 months that he's there with the Monarchs. But if there was any concern, and I oftentimes talk to Buck about this, the one concern was not about Jackie's ability to take the social pressure. He was built the right way to be able to handle that. The question in their minds was, had he played enough baseball?
Yeah.
Succeed on that level. Yeah.
The other thing that people aren't going to understand, because this is pretty old history for our living memory, but the war is over in 45. And so all of these guys are going to come back, and Jackie's out of the Army. It's like, well, what am I going to do now? Am I going to go work at a plant? And had he played enough baseball? Who the hell thinks, he thinks he can because he's got that competitive athletic ability, I'm assuming. But there's a lot of guys writing letters saying, hey, I'm about to get out of the Army. I need a spot on a team, And so just that chance, look, he's good enough of an athlete, he's going to get a look, right? But that doesn't mean it's a layup. And then if he doesn't have a good tryout, that would be normal. Like, let me get the speed of the game back into my legs. I've been in the Army, and I've been in court. I haven't played a lot of baseball. All of that is over his head going, I don't think you're going to make this, man. And so it's not a foregone conclusion that he ever gets the job.
And to be honest, Pete, had the Monarchs had their full roster intact, I'm not sure Jackie would ever have gotten invited. When Jackie joins the Monarchs, Buck O'Neil was still serving in the Navy, Subic Bay, Philippines. A ball player named Henry Thompson. And Giant fans should know Henry Thompson, Hank Thompson. Henry Thompson is the only baseball player to hold the distinction of having integrated 2 major league teams. He integrates the St. Louis Browns, and he also integrates the New York Giants. See, he's there before both Willie and Monty Irvin. As a matter of fact, Hank Thompson, Willie Mays, and Monty Irvin formed the Major's first all-black outfield. And so he's serving in the Army. A Hall of Fame ball player that played for the Monarchs named Willard Brown. Josh Gibson named him Home Run Brown. And if Gibson named you home run, then you probably got some power. And Willard Brown was a do-it-all, power-hitting outfielder who's in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. He was serving in the Army. Ted Strong. Ted Strong was Dave Winfield before we ever knew who Dave Winfield was. 6'7", weighed about 240, freakish athlete, played every position except for pitcher and catcher. He's a 6'7" shortstop. And with power and speed. And when he wasn't playing for the Monarchs, he starred for the Harlem Globetrotters.
Dang.
He too is serving in the Navy. So if the Monarchs have that full roster intact, I'm not sure Jackie gets invited to try out for the team, or they would have accepted the invitation, his invitation to try out for the team. And how would history have been altered? It makes you wonder about those kinds of things.
Yeah. Well, and I don't want to knock any player, but Dan Bankhead wasn't the guy, even though he was there the same year. And Hank Thompson did it twice, but he wasn't the guy who said, I'm great. These guys are good guys.
Hank Thompson had Hall of Fame pedigree. Unfortunately, his personal demons derailed what I think could have been a Hall of Fame career. He was outstanding. As I mentioned, they formed the Major's first black outfield. Hank Thompson was an infielder by trade. I mean, that's how good Hank Thompson was. And so his own personal demons, alcohol and women, and they've gotten a bunch of us. So Hank ain't in this by himself. It kind of derailed what was still a very good major league career, but could have been a great, potentially Hall of Fame caliber career. And it makes you wonder what if. But those early guys, you mentioned Dan Bankhead, and he answered to a trivia question. Who's the first black pitcher in the major leagues? Everybody seemingly thinks it was Satchel, but it was Dan Bankhead. Dan Bankhead had electric stuff. He did that great stuff. But Buck O'Neil always believed that what hurt Dan was from a small town in Alabama. And he said that Dan was fearful of what might happen if he hit a white batter. So he wouldn't pitch inside. He could never harness his control when he got to the major leagues. And he was one of those unfortunate ones because there were a lot of major league owners And you could say that this goes against their own self-interest, and particularly their business interests, that wanted to see these Negro League players fail. They were bringing them in, but they kind of wanted to see them fail because it fit the narrative that they weren't good enough to be there anyway. And so a lot of the old Negro League players, particularly that somewhat older player, if they didn't come out the gate flying, they get relegated to the minor leagues and they couldn't get back. They couldn't get back there, you know, and Dan Bankhead was one of those. Dan Bankhead's first black pitcher to hit a home run in a game. His home run in his major league debut there, you know, and so it was unfortunate because that pitching role didn't really transition from the Negro Leagues anyway.
Yeah.
Because, again, it was seen as that cerebral position, and there was always this undercurrent that African-American athletes weren't smart enough to play that role. This was the same as the black quarterback.
Yeah. When did that start to turn? Because Don Newcomb comes along. I think he's 49 when he integrates. And again, Dodgers, so a little bit of the work has been done.
Branch Rickey was far more aggressive than the other owners in signing this talent.
Yeah.
Far more
and Don Newcomb goes to Korea also shortly after. I just want to put that in there because that can derail your career through calamity,
and it hurt his
whatever.
career because it hurt his numbers. You know, and when we start to try and make a case for whether Nuke should be in the Hall of Fame, which I certainly believe he should. He's the first, as you know, to be named Rookie of the Year, MVP, and Cy Young winner. You know, and that's how dominant Nuke was when he first came out of the Negro Leagues. Yeah, he had been pitching for Effa Manley's Newark Eagles, and makes the move over into the Dodgers organization and becomes a star, the first African-American pitcher to win 20 games in Major League Baseball history, does it in the National League. And then my dear friend, the late, great Jim Mudcat Grant, would win 20 in the American League to become the first black pitcher to win 20 games in the American League. And so I got to know Nuke. And the thing that surprised me when I first met Nuke was how big he was. Yeah, he's tall man, big man. You know, he stood every bit, 6'3", 6'4", but he had a presence about him, and you could see that he was a workhorse on the mound. You know, and he had some personal demons that that certainly interrupted his career, as well as military service that interrupted his career. Or I certainly believe he was on the way to the Hall of Fame had those issues not propped up.
Shortly after this, and we talked a little bit about this off mic, and I want to kind of explore this a little bit, is the Latin American integration is going on as well. We've got rights to the Felipe Alou book that he and Peter Karasotis wrote. I'm hopefully going to put together a documentary here in the next year. But the, when Felipe arrives, it's so here's the thing about Felipe, right? And I don't want to spoil my own movie, but I'm going to say these couple things because this is, you can read the book and you should. He isn't a baseball player when he goes to the Pan Am games in 55, and then Dominican Republic says, you know what, put down that javelin, take off them track cleats, and actually come play baseball. He could play, but he wasn't going as a baseball player. So at the last minute, they change him. The Dominicans win the whole dang thing in 55. And there's all the great stuff. There's fights involved and everything, all this great stuff. And so then baseball, particularly the Giants, go, hold on. The Dominican Republic is a place where we can go get players. And so he makes it in. And here's the weird thing is, so now it's 56. He signed a contract and he goes to Louisiana. And in spite of the way the whole nation was moving, Louisiana's like, we've changed our mind on what we're going to allow access to. It turns out, and this is 10 years after Jackie Robinson integrates, we're not going to allow black and white players on the field. And this is when, Felipe's like, I'm not black. I'm not black. My dad's black. My mom's white. I'm from an island. I don't know what the hell you're talking about. I speak Spanish. How am I black? So it's another era. And then baseball didn't know how to deal with the Latin players. And so we can look at, and we know the great career and the humanitarian that Roberto Clemente was, but Clemente and Felipe, they have to teach baseball like, hey, we're different. We're from a different part of the world. We don't have a stable government. These places are being overturned by dictators and everything else. And so there's a whole different era of civil rights within the civil rights movement that starts to, hey, no Spanish in the dugout, all that kind of stuff is happening during that time. Any thoughts on any of that stuff at all?
Well, it's an important part of our story because the Negro Leaguers, I should say, were really the first Americans to play in many Spanish-speaking countries.
Mm.
When we went to those countries, we were treated like heroes. So we're going to stay in the finest hotels, eat in the finest restaurants that those countries had to offer, and then you come back home and you're treated like a second-class citizen.
God.
And as a result, a lot of Negro League players would call those Spanish-speaking countries home for one simple reason. In those countries, we weren't black baseball players. We were just baseball players. But in this country, the Spanish-speaking athlete, particularly the Afro-Latino athlete, they couldn't play in the major leagues either. So they found sanctuary playing in the Negro Leagues. So when Jackie breaks color barrier, he doesn't do it for just American-born blacks. He does it for every player of color who now enjoys this great game. And the great Louis Tiant, El Tiante, one of my very favorite people in the game, his father played in the Negro Leagues. And we think about my good friend Minnie Minoso, who when he walked in the room lit up.
Totally.
The energy that he exuded. Just one of the most joyous people I've ever been around. I miss him dearly. And he bypassed more lucrative opportunities to play in the Negro Leagues, where he played for the New York Cubans, and helped the Cubans win a World Series before he transitions into the major leagues. But those ball players, even though they didn't speak English well, they spoke Spanish. They were called the N-word, just like we were being called the N-word. And it was a symbiotic relationship that generated a beautiful bond between the two cultures.
Yeah.
And when Roberto Clemente comes, people forget that Roberto Clemente was in the Dodgers organization. He is the one that got away. Yeah, he's the one that got away. They didn't protect him. And when he comes to the Dodgers, he spoke very little English. You know who his interpreter was?
No, who was it?
Joe Black, the great Dodger Joe Black, who was quite fluent in Spanish, would oftentimes interpret for Roberto Clemente. And Roberto Clemente's baseball idol was Monty Irvin, the great Monty Irvin, who, when he went to Puerto Rico to play, and Roberto Clemente Jr. told me this, that his father idolized Monty Irvin and that he used to carry Monty's uniform to the ballpark. Because if you carried the player's uniform to the ballpark, they let you in the game for free. And that Monty Irvin gave his dad his first real baseball glove. And that's who Roberto Clemente wanted to be. And I say that to say this. Roberto Clemente would go on to be a hero to so many. And he was, both as a ball player and as a humanitarian. But what it also tells us is this: every hero has a hero. And for young Roberto Clemente, it was the great Monty Irvin who was his hero.
Yeah. Boy, Monty Irvin can play. So you look at his numbers and you just, so many people from that era, the Depression, the World War, some of these guys, First World War, and you see, like, we often put the time machine on players. Like, I'd like to see Babe Ruth play today. Like, I'd like to see you be born in 1895 and make it to 18 because 1 in 4 chance you die. What do these guys eat? Like, one of their main staples was pork lard, like as a main part of their meal, and so
that's a part of my meal. We cooked, my mother cooked everything in lard. As a matter of fact, we made the lard because we had the pigs. So I grew up as a country boy in the Deep South. You ain't telling me nothing that I don't know.
No antibiotics, lead everywhere, and none of these guys live a long time. It's so common for all players, white, black, whatever, to die at age 60. And I mean die like, hey, I'm alive, boom, dead, heart attack, whatever, and so any era has its disadvantages and all that kind of stuff, but it does seem like, and let me just say this, Bob, and I want to get your thoughts on this. We often talk about players pre-integration, and integration is a thing, and it changes the game and allows more talent. But if you played in 1915, how do you even get into Major League Baseball? Like there's just only so many jobs. Once you have one, you never leave it. If you grew up in Nebraska, I don't know how many great Nebraska ball players came out to the game in 1915 because it just wasn't a thing. It was all hard. And so we look at integration, it's critical, and nobody wants, there to be that kind of segregation and discrimination. But every era has micro eras in it, expansion. Every time the game expands, if the ball is hard, if the strike zone moves, all of these things impact how the game is played. So I don't know. It's just we tend to simplify these things that are actually rather complex.
Yeah. But that's the nature of our game, and the baseball and the periods in our lives that are marked still by baseball. Even in the midst of tragedy, baseball seems to always be the one consistent. And I truly believe that if you know the history of baseball, you essentially know the history of this country.
That's true.
Now, Negro Leagues had been wrongfully omitted from that baseball history piece. And as a museum, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to basically fill in the gap in the pages of American history books to include this incredible piece of baseball and Americana. But that's the nature of our game.
It is. And I love that you're doing it. And I just get so excited about it. I know you guys are trying to raise money. How can people help you directly right now? What's the best way?
If you want to support this new initiative by the museum, and it's called Pitch for the Future, you can visit us at NLBM.com. And there's a donation tab on the page, and you can select Pitch for the Future and make your tax-deductible contribution to help us build the new Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. And we are, like I said, really excited about this big challenge that is still ahead of us. But it's an exciting challenge, and we think we have an opportunity to do something that will position this museum for the next 30 plus years of its existence, and in essence, leave something that generations to come will have an opportunity to come here and learn and hopefully be inspired by this incredible story of triumph over adversity.
Yeah, it really is an incredible story, and the characters, and we could go on and talk about. I mean, I'm always fascinated by the guys who didn't quite make it great enough, but we're going to run out of time, so we can't do that. I did want to ask you, help me understand when Felipe gets there and it's like, you're black. He's like, I'm not black, and the black guys are like, he's not black. So what is that difference between a Latin player who's like a Negro Latin player versus someone who's an American black player? Like, what is that space, and how did those groups deal with that?
Well, the fundamental difference is they spoke Spanish, and that's really it. Because in many cases their skin was as dark as mine, but they just spoke Spanish. They spoke Spanish, and to think about it, that in this country, particularly while these guys were playing in the Negro Leagues, there were guys who could go into a restaurant and get a meal where the American-born blacks couldn't. And so you had men and women who were as American as anyone, who were being treated as un-American as anyone, to the point that some of those American-born blacks would try to speak a broken down Spanish because it might enable them to get a meal where otherwise they couldn't get a meal. It speaks to how backward this country really was. And as baseball fans, we were cheated. We were really cheated because we should have seen all the great stars take the field to compete with and against one another. There should have never been two separate leagues, but because there were two separate leagues, it gave us an opportunity to tout these lesser heralded ball players who people should know about and don't know about, because it was built out of the spirit of, if you won't let me play with you, then I'll create my own. And what a beautiful league and a beautiful story that they they created, and we get to tell that story. And we get the task of trying to keep that story alive when there's only a handful of these legendary Negro League stars still with us. We don't want this story to die when that last Negro Leaguer leaves the face of this earth. I tell my guests all the time, the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum doesn't need to survive. It has to survive so that we don't lose this piece of baseball and Americana, so that our children now have a place where they can come and learn something that none of us were privy to during our own formal educations. But again, Pete, not only learn it for its tremendously rich educational value, but maybe even more important, it's inspirational value. Yeah, it inspires you to dream about possibilities. And we don't want to take that away from our children. So oftentimes their dreams are taken by those who don't believe in their dream. You know, instead of you having your own dream, you trying to rob our kids of their dream. And the Negro League kind of fuels that ability to dare to dream. And to me, that's where the inspirational aspect of this story comes to life.
Love it. I have donated. While you were talking, I went in. That's how easy it is. Everybody should do this. Join me. There's the link right down there, or look in the remarks over there, or over there, wherever they are, or just go to the dang Negro League Museum and then type it. You'll see the donate page. Super easy. And just look, kick in. If all of you kicked in any amount of money, it's going to be more money than they had 10 minutes ago.
Absolutely.
So do that. And get to Kansas and see this amazing. If you love all these new bronze statues they've done, your mind will be blown when all of these figures speak to you, because they do. You feel it. I'll close with this and I'll let you finish up. Here in LA, everybody's buried here. There's all kinds of people. And if you walk up to Jelly Roll Morton's grave, he'll talk to you. You know, he's there. He can't stop creating music and art and sense. So you just stand there and you just sit with Jelly Roll for a few minutes. It's the same thing in your wonderful field of legends. It's a remarkable thing.
Yeah, it speaks to your soul. It really does, and it's very powerful. It's very moving, and it's a very fitting tribute to what I call America's unsung baseball heroes. And we want to make sure that the legacy of the Negro Leagues continues to play on. And so we're all very proud of the work that we've done. We know that there's still so much work left to be done. And we feel like we can have tremendous positive impact on the lives of future generations through this story, as they kind of see through the lens of those who overcame adversity to go on to greatness.
Yeah. Thanks for coming on, man. I'm going to roll these credits. Hang on. I'll be right back.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you.